The focus of our discussion today is on change agents. And if you're implementing any kind of change, you're going to need change agents at the local level. Many of you are likely playing the role of a change agent right now, even if you don't know it or you haven't labeled it that way in your organization. Today, we want to identify what we mean by the term change agent so that we're all talking from the same kind of definition. What kind of skills and traits your change agents should have, how your change agents can and should contribute to building readiness for your changes. And then we're also going to spend some time talking about what I think is likely the most important job that change agents have. And that's about how to contract with sponsors. And we will spend a few minutes talking about that very important topic. It's important to level set and understand the different roles in the change process. So let's take a look at who the players are in the change process. What you see on the slide in front of you are, first off, what we call champions. These are individuals who believe in the change and want to see it happen, but they don't have the resources, power, or money to make it happen. They're looking for sponsorship to drive the change. They're important because they often have influence with key sponsors. And as agents, you can use them to help leverage those sponsors, which we'll talk about momentarily. The second role is the agent. Agents are responsible for helping plan and implement the change. Often their performance evaluations are tied to how successful the implementation is. They spend time coaching and educating sponsors, translating the frame of reference between sponsors and targets, and working with targets to surface issues that need sponsor resolution. Then we have the sponsor role. There are two types: an authorizing sponsor who has the power, money, and resources to get the change going, and a reinforcing sponsor, any leader with direct reports who have to make the change. Finally, we get to the targets, those impacted by the change. They have to shift behaviors, thinking, and ways of working. People may not like to use the word target. We feel it is accurate because if the arrow doesn't hit the target, it is not the fault of the target. Typically, what happens in organizations is that people are chosen to be agents based on their subject matter expertise. Subject matter expertise is important, but it's only one component, and often a small component, of what's critical in order to be an effective agent. I always say, look for people who have good strategy, who have the ability to learn the subject matter and have the skills, before you choose someone just because they're a subject matter expert. The two skills, as I sum up this slide, that are critical are that change agents have to have trust and credibility with the targets and with the sponsors. Above all else, above subject matter expertise, above everything I'm going to talk about on this slide, they have to have trust and credibility with sponsors and with targets. So let's break that down a little bit. The other components or characteristics, competencies, that agents have to have include being known for having a successful personal and organizational history. They should be individuals known for resolving issues, known for having influence. If you choose people because you want to rehabilitate, which people often do, know that if they're not seen as successful in the past, you're going to have to work a lot harder to overcome that reputation. We've talked about success, credibility, and trust, so we'll pop down to the fourth one: awareness of the culture in the organization and the subcultures involved in the change. Because as we talk today, you'll see that one size doesn't fit all. The strategies we talk about have to be custom fit based on the culture. Obviously, they have to believe in the project. They have to have knowledge or be able to learn about the business units they're working in. And they have to have a strong sense of strategic know-how. They have to be able to translate the sponsor's frame of reference. And when I say frame of reference, I'm talking about your set of beliefs, how you think about things, your perspective. They have to be able to translate what the sponsor believes into the language of the target. And they also need to help the sponsor understand the target's frame of reference as well. You're really kind of like an agent at the UN doing a lot of translation. Another critical trait: they must be able to develop teamwork among the players throughout the change. They need to unify, to take diverse perspectives and weave those together. Also really critical is having a great deal of comfort with ambiguity, because what happens throughout the change often isn't known. And they have to help others work through that ambiguity too. That's a little bit about the competencies of an agent. Being a change agent is a tough role. You have to have a lot of courage. You have to be strong. You have to be willing to stand up to sponsors, to call things as you see them, and to articulate those things clearly. We will move to the next slide and start to talk about what is sponsorship exactly. Sponsorship is action and position, and I really emphasize that action part. Oftentimes, sponsors are chosen because their job title or their interest is in the area that you're working in. And sponsors have a lot of work to do, so we're going to spend the next portion talking about that work. You can't volunteer to be a sponsor. You're either a sponsor, an authorizing sponsor, because you have the power, the money, or the resources, as I said earlier, to get the change going. Or you're a reinforcing sponsor because you have individual direct reports who have to make the change. So when it comes to impacting behavioral change, what we look at in this particular slide is what you say, what's communicated, what's expressed. The newsletters, the vision statements, the speeches that get made. When you're thinking about changing behavior, what you say or express has about 15% impact on changing behaviors. What you model, what you show people, how you behave has another 35% impact. What you reinforce is about 50% or greater in terms of actually changing behaviors. So when you think about kids or teenagers, what you say to them has a lot less impact. What you model as a parent or an adult to them also has less impact. But what you reinforce, that has the most impact. So think about a child who you tell, don't touch a hot stove. And you model it as an adult. You don't touch the hot stove. Typically, when does the child learn not to touch a hot stove? When they touch the stove and they get burnt, or it hurts. So you have to remember that the actions of the sponsor, while it's important to communicate, to model, to walk the talk, it's critical that sponsors also reinforce. I worked on a huge initiative with physicians. And what we said to the physicians was, we want to enhance the quality of the patient experience. So we communicated that as senior executives. We modeled that. And we were reinforcing patients per hour, bed days per month, all kinds of quantitative items. So what do you get? You get quantity. You didn't get the quality. So we really had to look at making sure there was alignment between what we said, what we modeled, and what we reinforced. So one of your roles as an agent is going to be to educate sponsors on this concept and to help them create alignment between what they say, what they do, and what they reinforce. All right, so let's take a look at the next slide. And how is it in these complex organizations that you're working in that you build successful sponsorship? A key component to doing so is making sure that you build sponsorship level by level, starting with the authorizing sponsor through their direct reports to the next level and so on, until you reach the lowest impacted level of targets in the organization. In this particular example, what we see here is the vice president, or the authorizing sponsor in this particular change, is trying to impact the targets who are 3 levels down from that individual, without the involvement of the levels in between. And oftentimes, this happens when a senior person, or the authorizing sponsor, sends out the videos or they have town halls, and they believe that that's enough. It's not. Because one of the saddest pieces of information I ever communicate to a CEO or a president is that the only people you have direct control over are your 10 to 15 direct reports. If you say something in the organization, or you visit a factory or a particular site and then leave, and the supervisor says to that group of targets, you know what, we're not going to do that here, who are they going to listen to? Their direct boss, the supervisor or the CEO? We all know the answer. It's their direct boss. So you've got to make sure that you build sponsorship level by level, or you create a black hole. And if you create a black hole, it's very difficult to get the momentum that you need. So what we look to do in terms of creating successful sponsorship is depicted on the next slide. Where you see that on the next slide? The vice president in this case, the authorizing sponsor, and depicted by the dotted line, focuses their energies on their direct reports, the 2 directors in this case, and is clear with those directors about the expectations they have of them, vis-a-vis their own behavior and what they need to do with their direct reports. In turn, those directors, the level 2 sponsors, the reinforcing sponsors in this particular situation, are clear with the next level down, level 3, the manager level. They are the ones that articulate, here is what I expect of you. Here is what is going to happen with the change. Here is what you need to do with your direct reports. And so on down to the next level. So you have to, as an agent, make sure that level by level, the sponsors are focusing on their direct reports and one level down to make sure that the change is driven through the organization. Now, as you look at this, anytime you have someone opt out, you're going to create that black hole again. In other words, if one of these directors or managers is not on board, you're going to have a black hole at the level below. Anytime you see issues with targets in the organization, it may not necessarily be the fault of the target. Where you need to look to make changes and to intervene is one level up. Okay, so let's take a look at what are the most important tasks that sponsors have and that they cannot delegate. In my experience, oftentimes sponsors do try to delegate these tasks, and they try to delegate them to you, the agent. It's critical that in your role as agent, you don't allow that to happen. A large part of your role, as I said earlier, is in educating sponsors as to what your role is. Typically, when I see poor sponsorship, it's because sponsors often don't even know what they're supposed to do. No one's really ever told them. So let's take a look at this. In addition to aligning what they say, what they model, and what they reinforce, sponsors are also responsible for establishing and communicating the business case for action. What are we changing? Why are we changing? What are the consequences of not making the change? What are my expectations? What is the time frame for this change? And that is something that sponsors absolutely have to do. Now, as an agent, you can help prepare that business case with them. You can help prepare them for the communication, but they are the individuals who have to communicate this information. They have to participate in goal setting. What are the expectations from their direct reports? At what point in the change process will certain things take place? They have to establish those expectations of the change, and for their individual direct reports. They also have to allocate resources. So in other words, if you, in planning the change as an agent, believe that you need certain individuals full-time, not half-time, they need to make sure that they supply those individuals to you. They need to ensure that the right people are involved in the change. And the fifth thing you see is they really need to concentrate their energies, as I said earlier, on cascading sponsorship by working with their direct reports. I think it's important that you also work with the sponsors to make sure they have periodic check-ins or feedback sessions, 2 levels down. Because that's the only way they're going to get feedback on how well their direct reports are doing with that next level down. One of the mistakes I see a lot in organizations, particularly at the higher levels, senior vice president levels, CEOs, they often believe that, you know what, my direct reports don't need all that care and feeding. Because they're senior people. They know this. And I can't tell you how many times a senior executive will say to me, seriously? I need to spend all this time going through the objectives, explaining my expectations behaviorally with my direct reports. They know it. And they don't. So as an agent, it's important that you make sure at the higher level, there's not an assumption that direct reports or high-level sponsors are going to really understand their role. So again, I get back to your role as an agent, in educating sponsors, helping them educate their direct reports, and working with the next level down to educate their direct reports, and so on and so on. The other thing that sponsors have to do, and we've talked about this, is to apply those reward systems for their direct reports. You'll be working with sponsors to identify change-specific rewards, and making sure those rewards are applied. Or if you have old behaviors that are counterproductive to the change, that sponsors apply negative consequences for those old behaviors. And we all know this is a difficult thing for sponsors to do, the whole reinforcement component. So I'll tell you ahead of time. A majority of your work will be in helping sponsors apply those rewards, understand what rewards need to be applied, and know when to push that button. And finally, sponsors are responsible for monitoring progress constantly. What's expected at the beginning, middle, and end of any implementation will change. So constant monitoring is critical to staying current and on track. That's a lot to digest. But this is a slide that I would say, keep on you at all times, because you're going to use it in educating and coaching sponsors. And they really appreciate having a crisp, clear understanding of, okay, now I understand what sponsorship means and what I have to do. So on the next slide, what we're going to see is a template of what we refer to as a key role map. And this is something that as a change agent, you'll be responsible for delivering in your organization. And we have a process that we go through that gets you there. A lot of you may be thinking, okay, well, it just looks like an organizational chart to me. And we do that. But this is more than a verbal stakeholder analysis. What we have people do in any change is to think about who are impacted at the lowest levels of the organization. And throw out the organizational chart for just a moment and think about lowest levels of impact. List all of those targets that are impacted, and then ask the question, who is going to be the reinforcing sponsor for those individuals? And are those individuals targets as well? And if they're a target, then who is their reinforcing sponsor? Build this chart from the bottom up. And we do that because it really changes your thinking. When you think about the typical org charts, or you think top down, you often forget target groups that are involved. And that's a huge mistake. So in order to avoid that, you've got to produce a key role map by thinking first. Who are all those impacted targets at the bottom of the organization? And build it from the bottom up. It really changes your thinking. And we also ask that you think about targets in terms of indirect as well as directly impacted. You may have unions in your organization, and they're going to be targets of the change too. So there will be strategies as an agent that you're going to help sponsors develop. For indirect as well as direct sponsors, you might have HR as an indirect sponsor or IT. Now, we're not going to spend a lot of time on building a key role map. That's a different process in and of itself. But we wanted to give you an example of what one looks like. And when you look at this particular key role map, what you're going to see is that the CEO is also an authorizing sponsor in this case. And then right when you get to the next level down, the VP level, you see that there's a T1. And what that means is that in this particular change, they are also a target of the change. And they're your first level target. Often your first level targets are going to be those that are higher up in the organization. And as I talked about earlier, you need to make sure that you deal with their thoughts, feelings, and emotions about the change as a target first, before they can be an effective reinforcing sponsor. In this case, we see that one VP is also an agent. The other VP is a target and a reinforcing sponsor. So again, this depicts for you the various role overlap and the rigor you need to apply to create a key role map. If you have questions about the key role map, please bring them up in the workshop. So one of the things that's really critical, and we'll start to talk about that, is sponsor contracting. So how do I get sponsors to do all of these things that we're talking about? The way in which we do that we'll spend a great deal of time on today, is the sponsor contract and how you contract with a sponsor. You know, we write business plans in organizations. Business plans clarify what's expected. They identify the key actions that are required to drive success, and measure and recalibrate as needed. The sponsorship contract is really a business plan for sponsorship, and it is critical to successful change and to being a successful agent. What it does basically is translate the change agent's needs into a clear and specific agreement that you can act on, that the sponsor can use to act on, and that you can measure sponsor success against. Obviously, it ensures that sponsors are clear on what's expected throughout the change. As I said, sponsorship actions required at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the change will often vary. So what you're going to be doing is making sure sponsors understand that the contract you have at the beginning may be different in the middle and at the end. And one of the things that sponsors can expect to hear from you is feedback and recontracting throughout the stages of the process. It's not a one-and-done situation. You don't meet with the sponsor off the bat, create a contract, and that's it. You're going to be meeting with that sponsor or group of sponsors periodically, looking at the contract, providing feedback, and changing as required. It enables you to really look at what needs to happen in major change and how you reinforce sponsors and help them calibrate what they need to express, model, and reinforce. Because you're going to spell it out in the contract. And by having these contracts, it drives consistency across the organization. If you leave it to chance, every sponsor is going to have their own spin on things. And oftentimes, the change starts to change in different parts of the organization. So the contract really acts like a leadership blueprint. Let me give you a couple of variables that you need to consider when contracting. People always ask this question. We talk about this with the sponsors. Do we really have to write it down? An informal contract is really a conversation. A formal contract is something that's written down. You have to know your sponsor to understand if they work better with formal or informal contracts. Sponsors are busy. They have the best of intentions when you have the conversation with them. But then you leave the room, a crisis comes up, or something else happens. And it's often difficult to remember specifically what you talked about. Some sponsors really appreciate having something written that they can refer to. Others would be insulted. A couple of things to think about in creating formal versus informal contracts. Are you dealing with a sponsor who has a history of strong sponsorship? If they do, you can do a lot of informal. You can do a lot of discussion. You don't need as extensive formal written contracts as you do with sponsors who don't have that history or who are new to sponsorship. Then you have to look at the commitment level. If you have sponsors that are really committed, oftentimes they're already educated or intuitively know what to do. So again, your work as an agent will be less. You also have to assess, what's the risk with this sponsor? What's the risk that they may not follow through? If there's a high risk, the written contract is much more important. And how easy is it to provide feedback to this individual? If it's difficult, again, a written contract becomes essential. So you can go back and remind the sponsor, this is what we agreed to. Let's talk about what's happening and what I see you need to do differently to be more effective in accelerating this change. Okay, so a couple of things to think about in contracting. On the next slide, let's look at how you think about what you want the sponsor to do. So as an agent, before you even put the contract together, what are some things that you need to think about that need to go into that contract? One of the ways I like to organize the thoughts around that is to think back to express, model, and reinforce. So, on a piece of paper, what is it that you need that sponsor to communicate? Who do they need to communicate it to? When do they need to communicate it? What are the messages that their direct reports need to hear? And remember, what's expressed accounts for only about 15% of actual behavior change. What's modeled is another 30 to 35%. So you have to look at how are sponsors going to demonstrate their support. What actions? What meetings do they need to attend? What access do you need to that individual? What feedback will you need from them? What components do they really need to understand? This is really a checklist for you to start thinking about what to include in a sponsor contract. One of the things I find in my experience is that it's easiest for sponsors to come up with what they need to communicate. But again, communication is only 15% of impact. They're often pretty good at the modeling components, and sometimes they need a little help, depending on the individual and their experience. Now, what are some of the questions and content you need to include in the contract around reinforcement, since that accounts for 50% or more of behavior change? This is the toughest for sponsors, so you can anticipate spending a lot of time with them, helping them understand what needs to be reinforced, when with whom, and how to recognize people's efforts, what can or cannot be tolerated. And as I said earlier, the higher up you go in the organization, the tougher it is for leaders to give negative feedback to their direct reports. You'll need to coach and support them through that. Now, a couple of situations I've been in. People have asked me, aren't sponsors, especially at senior levels, going to be overwhelmed by a sponsor contract? And the answer is yes, they might be. But once you go through it with them, they really appreciate the work you've done. It helps them articulate their role. And it's a great opportunity for you to establish a strong relationship with them. Right off the bat, they see that you're helping them be more effective. You're thinking through the contract, putting your ideas in, and guiding them through it. That's something sponsors appreciate across the organization. So, a few contracting tips. Before your first meeting with the sponsor, make sure you've thought through everything we just talked about. I suggest working with a small team, people respected by the sponsor, to draft the contract. Work through this with fellow agents who know the sponsor well. You might even include some change champions we talked about earlier. These are people who believe in the change, want to see it happen, but don't have the power or resources to make it happen. Still, they may have strong influence with the sponsor. Bring them in to help shape the contract, and make sure you explain the benefits of the contract to the sponsor, in their frame of reference, not yours. Let them know you understand they're busy, but you believe this will be useful, and explain why. And as I said earlier, take other agents with you if helpful, or a respected champion. When it comes to how you set up that environment, you have to be honest. Create a safe space. State what you need. Be clear, courageous, and honest about what you need and why. Anytime you ask a sponsor for something, whether it's their time, their presence at a meeting, or outreach to others, you must also explain the business impact it will have in accelerating the change. Watch for nonverbal cues. Everything I'm talking about here, you've probably heard in leadership or performance conversations. But in a past example, working with my boss during a change, I could tell something was off. He was uncomfortable, and I had to say, "Is something going on for you? Let's talk about it." Because in that case, he was still a target in the change. And we all know, nonverbals are often more important than what's actually said. That's a challenge, because these days you're often not face-to-face with sponsors. You're on the phone, or if you're lucky, a video chat, so you can see those nonverbals. But when you can't, ask more questions. Listen carefully to how the sponsor responds. Be open to feedback. And as we've said, be courageous in offering constructive feedback too. So, one last point before we move on. Let's take a look at an actual template of a contract that you can use. And here's one I like. I have a slide for you where you'll see this template. The actual contract we use will not say sample sponsor contract. It will just list out that this is a sponsor contract. And I'll break down the sections in a moment. The top 3 to 5 critical next steps that the sponsor needs to work on in order of priority, and the time frame for completion. Then we're looking at what are the supporting behaviors or tasks required of others, those direct reports to the sponsor. So you have to think about, in contracting with the sponsor, what do you need them to get done with their direct reports? And that's going to tell you the actions they need to take as a sponsor. Then we have a column that says action type. And you'll see as we go into this contract, as I depict it, we're looking at, is that action something that's expressed or a communication action? Is it modeled or is it reinforced? All right, let's break this down. When we talk about the next component of the sponsor contract, we're thinking through identifying and prioritizing the 3 to 5 critical next steps, the business steps that have to happen in order of priority. So here we have that we needed to assemble a cross-functional task team to identify, in this particular change, the key overlaps between a current system and the new system. And we're talking about a technical change in this example. Second, we need to establish service-level agreements with field locations and all corporate functional areas for how they're going to work with each other, given the changes we're going to make in the organization to bring in this new system. And then, in this particular example, the third priority is determining those user training requirements that we need to implement this new system while moving from the current systems. And as you all know, typically you're moving from legacy systems or current systems to new systems. So again, just an example. We're focusing on 3 to 5 critical business steps. Once you have your brief description of the change and the 3 to 5 critical next steps filled out in the contract, you need to think this through prior to meeting with the sponsor. Have something to calibrate, and then get their input on what they see as the 3 to 5 most critical steps. The next component of the contract is filling out. Given these critical next steps, what is it that you need from others? Typically, it's from direct reports. And it may also be, in a sponsored situation, from colleagues that they're going to be working with. So in this particular case, as an example, given that setting up meetings for looking at overlap was the first priority, One of the actions required from direct reports is that they'll need to collaborate with their peers going forward. And you can see at the bottom of that, we have a 1 and a 2. That action supports the first and second priority in this example. Then we look at what are the specific actions that the sponsor needs to take. And you see that they need to jointly kick off the first meeting of the task team. That's a modeling behavior. By kicking off the meeting, by attending, they're modeling to others that this is important to them. A reinforcing component, and also a modeling component, is participating in at least 25% of the meetings. Oftentimes, the sponsor will kick off the first meeting and expect you as the agent to conduct the rest, which is perfectly acceptable if they've already communicated the business case, participated in goal setting, taken on the 6 sponsor tasks we talked about earlier, and introduced you as, here's the individual that's going to help you meet my expectations. Yes, you can run those meetings, but you still want that sponsor to show up periodically, so others know they're committed. So what we've listed here are the various actions the sponsor needs to take. And then in the action type column, we've listed whether that's modeling or reinforcement behavior, what you need to look at when creating these contracts. Again, it's easier for sponsors to say, I can communicate that, I can model that. But the reinforcing component, as we know, is 50% or more. In this particular situation, we determined it was actually 70%. Sometimes it's even more important than the 50%. You need to make sure there's enough reinforcement built into the contract. You don't want it weighted too heavily on expressed or modeled actions. You want the reinforcement pieces to drive traction and acceleration. If you have questions about this, please bring them up in the live workshop. Okay, I know that's a lot of information. Let's take a look at the value of contracts. We talked earlier about how they're really useful for the sponsor, and I do think written contracts are critical. I like to say to a sponsor, I've been recording what we've talked about. I'm going to put that together for you and send it your way. And once you receive it, let's talk again to make sure I understood what you expected of me. That's really your way of checking in, making sure you captured what they needed, and also clarifying what you need. It gives you a way to assess and benchmark sponsor performance. It's something to refer back to. And remember, sponsors need both positive and corrective feedback. Even people at the senior most levels need to hear what's working and what might need adjustment. And that's part of your role as an agent. To let them know what's working with the targets and recalibrate where needed. So it always becomes a starting point for renegotiation, based on what's going well and what's not going so well. Now, a couple of summary points. In contracting, planning is essential. I said earlier, work with other people, whether they're champions, other agents, or even targets who know the sponsor well. It's incredibly helpful to think through what you're going to ask the sponsor for before that first contracting conversation. Sometimes it's good to practice, just role play with a colleague. And remember, use business language. Talk about what you need from a business impact standpoint, how it accelerates early adoption of the change or project. Make sure you explain the contracting process in the sponsor's frame of reference, why it makes them more successful. Get their input on the contract. Modify it based on their feedback. And if their input isn't productive, be honest. Explain why. And talk about the business impact. Make sure the sponsor is clear on the benefits of the contracting process, that it gives them a reference tool, and ultimately makes their job easier. From the very first conversation, let them know you'll be recontracting with them continuously, assessing progress at the beginning, middle, and end of the change. And one thing I often say, you have to include this in the contract. I need to be able to get on your calendar or have a quick call when I need to. Sometimes sponsors are traveling or overloaded, but if you have an urgent issue, you need to be able to call their admin and say, I need to speak with them in the next 24 hours, or 4 hours, or 1 hour, and know that they'll respond. You don't necessarily have to use the word contract or contracting. You can call it whatever you want, but the process we've just talked about and the template we're using is critical.